Today we're out here in chilly Utah taking a look at the new 2019 Honda Passport. You can think of this as the more off-road capable and slightly less expensive Honda Pilot. So if you've been thinking to yourself, I don't really want something that's quite as big as a Pilot, I don't need the third row in the back, but I want a V6 engine instead of a 4-cylinder engine and a traditional automatic transmission instead of a CVT, then that's one good reason to upgrade from something like that CR-V into the Passport. With this vehicle, Honda is targeting shoppers that are looking for something a little bit more rugged, a little bit more off-road capable. And that's why we have tweaked styling up front versus the rest of Honda's lineup. So we have a grille that looks a little bit different than the Pilot or the Ridgeline, but this still definitely looks like a member of the Honda family. We don't have quite as much chrome going on up front as we do in some of the other Honda models, but we have LED headlamps that are standard and fog lamps down below that are also standard. The model that we're driving today is the top-end Elite trim, so we have front parking sensors and a bunch of other standard features inside the cabin that you don't find on the base trim. Now, if you're thinking to yourself that this looks a little bit wider than the Pilot on which it's based, then you're almost right, because the overall body dimensions are very similar, but we do have a wider track up front and in the back that helps give this a better off-road stance. Behind that large Honda logo lives a radar sensor because we do have Honda sensing standard on all trims of the Passport. That's something that we've seen from Honda in most of their new vehicles lately, and it's a little bit different than what we see in a lot of the competition. Honda Sensing is their all-encompassing active safety suite of technologies. Not only do we get radar adaptive cruise control, but we also get pre-collision warning, pre-collision braking, lane keeping assistance, etc. That system is combined with a camera right there behind the windscreen and gives you all the features that you see on the side of your screen. To create the Passport from the Pilot, basically what they did was they lifted the vehicle off the ground an additional inch to help improve overall approach, departure, and breakover angles, and then they actually shortened the vehicle by 6.2 inches, and all of that length comes right here out of the rear. That's because the Passport, like the Ford Edge and the Nissan Murano, is a 2-row crossover, not a 3-row crossover. So that's the big difference between this and the Pilot, is we don't have that third row right back there. That allowed them to style the overall vehicle a little bit more like your traditional 2-row crossover. So we have a little bit more of a kick up here, the window line drops down a little bit more, and then we get a slightly stronger rake to the rear window back here. Up front, we have basically the same sort of structure going on that we find in the Honda Pilot. So we still have an overhang there, we still have the V6 engine up front. This is the kind of vehicle for someone that is shopping for a 2-row vehicle, but they want a little bit more room on the inside, a little bit more power under the hood, perhaps a V6 engine instead of one of those 4-cylinder alternatives. The overall design out back is definitely conservative. We have combination LED tail lamp modules, which means that the brake lights are LEDs and then the turn signals in the middle are actually incandescent elements. Although the rear end of the vehicle shares no sheet metal with the Honda Pilot, you can definitely see the family resemblance back here. We have dual exhaust tips at the bottom to help make it look a little bit sportier, and then this center section of the rear bumper pulls off because that does hide a 2-inch hitch receiver. Under the hood, we again find one of the big differentiators between this and the average compact crossover in America. We have a standard 3.5-liter naturally aspirated V6, no turbo engines available under this hood. It produces 280 horsepower and 262 pound-feet of torque. This is basically the same drivetrain that we find under the hood of the Honda Pilot, only instead of starting with the 6-speed automatic like we see in the Pilot, all versions will have the 9-speed automatic transmission. This 9-speed automatic transmission was designed by ZF of Germany, and it's basically the same 9-speed that we find under the hood of vehicles like the Jeep Cherokee, the Range Rover Evoque, and of course some of Acura's lineup as well. There's been a lot said about this particular transmission and the overall shift quality. It doesn't shift quite like your average automatic or like Honda's own 10-speed automatic transmission, but that's all by design. If you want to know more about that, we have a video that goes into a deep dive on this 9-speed automatic transmission. Honda has made a few key improvements for the 2019 model year on this transmission, and that does overall improve shift quality, but it is still going to feel different than Honda's in-house designed 10-speed. Now on the bright side, the 9-speed automatic transmission has a very low first gear, which really helps improve overall acceleration, so this definitely feels peppy, and it also has a very tall final gear, which helps improve overall fuel economy. That comes in at 21 miles per gallon for the all-wheel drive model, 22 miles per gallon if you get the front-wheel drive model, and this transmission also helps this tow 5,000 pounds, which is among the best in this segment, excluding the Jeep Grand Cherokee, which will tow a little bit more thanks to its rear-wheel drive layout. All trims of the Passport come standard with 20-inch wheels, which is a little bit surprising for a vehicle with off-roading in mind. And this particular model has 265 with 45 series tires. The 45 series refers to the aspect ratio, how much rubber there really is sort of around the wheel. That means that there's a little bit less cushion on these wheels and tires than what we see in a more off-road focused entry like the Grand Cherokee or the Toyota 4Runner. On the flip side, we do have a little bit more cushion here than some of the sportier two-row crossovers out there, and Honda tells us that they deliberately targeted this balance between off-road dynamics and on-road dynamics. They wanted something that really straddled the fence between sportier entries like the Ford Edge and off-road focused entries like the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Another way that they've really managed to straddle this line is with the rear axle that we find here, because this basically uses the same all-wheel drive system as modern Acuras, only Honda is not calling this super handling all-wheel drive. They have a different name for it. But the system is basically the same. It can send up to 70% of engine power to the rear axle, even when the front axle is not slipping. The only other vehicles in this segment that can do that would be the rear-wheel drive entries like the Grand Cherokee or that 4Runner. So this can send more power to the rear axle than the Edge, the Murano, the Santa Fe, etc., assuming no front wheel slip. Now, if the front wheels do slip, then it can essentially send 100% of engine power to the rear. Then it has another trick up its sleeve. It has a torque vectoring rear axle, and that means that it can send 100% of the power destined to the rear of the vehicle to a single rear wheel, either the left one or the right one, whenever it chooses to. This obviously has a big advantage when it comes to on-road handling because it can actually help the vehicle turn into corners a little bit better, but the function off-road is also quite useful because it essentially acts as a mechanical limited slip differential, something that you also don't find in the average entry in this segment, but you do find available in those more rugged off-road vehicles. So this definitely is trying to straddle that fence between these two areas. The front seats and really the bulk of this interior, as you'll see in a bit, has been lifted directly from the Honda Pilot. So overall front seat comfort comes in very similar. We have a two-way adjustable lumbar support, not a four-way lumbar like we find in some of the competition, and we have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. As we see in the Honda Pilot, the passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. I do think that's a little bit of a pity. So this seat bottom cushion on the passenger side does not adjust for tilt, and it does not have the lumbar support. But this particular model does have both seat heating and seat ventilation. If you're shopping in the compact crossover segment and you're thinking to yourself that most of the seats you've encountered are just a little bit too narrow, they feel a little bit too small, that's one of the reasons you might want to jump up into this mid-size two-row crossover segment, because these seats are definitely a little bit larger, a little bit more padded, and a little bit more comfortable. As with the front seats, the rear seats are also shared essentially with the Pilot, and that would be the 8-passenger Pilot, because we don't have captain's chairs. That would be a little bit silly in a two-row vehicle. Overall legroom is basically the same as the front and second rows of the Pilot as well, right around 80 inches combined. That actually puts this on the low side for the mid-size two-row crossover segment, and actually below some of the compact crossovers out there as well. I kind of wish that Honda had adjusted things and actually pushed the second row seats a little bit further rearward. Now, on the bright side, unlike some compact crossovers, these actually have a pretty decent amount of recline to them, and they do slide forward and backward. The sliding seat mechanism helps you apportion space between the cargo area and the passenger area a little bit more. So if you want to put something larger back there, scoot the passenger seats forward, you can do that. Or if you want to put a child seat right here in the middle and scoot that child closer to the driver, that's going to be a lot easier when the seat moves in that manner. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, and we have an armrest right there in the middle with two cup holders. Although we find less combined legroom in this cabin than its competition, child seats are another reason that you might want to upgrade to a mid-size two-row crossover like this. Not only will you have a little bit more room to put a rear-facing child seat behind a taller driver up front or a taller passenger, you'll also be better able to put them right here in the middle because the front seats are a little bit further apart, so that child seat can actually fit there a little bit better. Or if you're the kind of family that needs to be able to carry two child seats in the back and say an adult, or perhaps three child seats across the back, it's going to be a lot easier in something that is wider like this Passport than the Honda CR-V. In addition to being a little bit wider on the inside, cargo capacity is one of the main reasons that you might want to get a larger two-row crossover over one of the compacts. We have over 41 cubic feet of storage space back here, which is absolutely cavernous when you compare this to something like the new RAV4 or smaller entries in that compact segment like the Hyundai Tucson. There is a great deal of room back here. You can see this is a 22-inch roller bag. It goes way back there. Honda also gives us some additional storage right here under the load floor. We have one bin in that section, and then if I lift the rest of this up, we find a spare tire and some additional storage, about 2.5 cubic feet total. The majority of the Passport's interior is shared with the larger Pilot, so we have a pretty standard-sized moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads, height-adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and two-way adjustable headrests. We're driving the Elite trim, so we have heated and ventilated front seats. You can see that we have that sort of crosshatch pattern going on there in the leather on the front seats. And then if I zoom out, you'll see that we have the same sort of independent armrest for the driver and front passenger that we find in that Pilot as well. These ratchet into position so that way you can adjust them for height. Over on the door panels, we find a combination of hard and soft touch materials. We have a soft touch upper section, some hard touch inserts right here around that door release, and of course the bottle holders at the bottom, and then a soft touch armrest. The overall dashboard design is again basically the same as the Pilot, so we have the same size glove box over there on the passenger side. That should be able to accommodate some of the larger tablet computers. The upper portion of the dashboard is made from a soft touch injection molded plastic. We then have some black accent strips that run across the cabin and a standard color touchscreen infotainment system. Apple CarPlay and Android Auto are available in this infotainment system, but they're not standard, so that is important to keep in mind. You won't find it in the base Sport model, but the EXL and above will get this particular system. If you want navigation, you have to work your way further on up the option ladder. Since we're driving the top-end model, we also have a center channel speaker right there above the infotainment screen. Below the infotainment screen, we find the engine start-stop button, the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system. This is kind of an unusual feature in a two-row mid-size crossover. Most of them feature only dual-zone climate control. We then have a small storage cubby here where you can put smaller items, the controls for the heated and ventilated seats, a wireless charging mat in this top-end trim right there. We do have a phone that supports that, but you cannot use Apple CarPlay or Android Auto wirelessly, so we do have this cable connected for that particular function. There's also a power outlet there. Continuing down from there, we have this new button module that Honda has been using across their lineup. Drive is down here, park is this button up top, reverse, you pull this button back towards the rear of the vehicle, and then we have a neutral button right there. Two large cup holders over there on the passenger side. This is the drive mode button that allows us to cycle between normal, snow, mud, and sand mode, and then a button to disable the engine start-stop system. Between the front seats, we don't have an armrest because those are on the sides of the seats. Instead, we have this roller cover for a storage area underneath. The roller cover has kind of an interesting texture right there on the surface. If I open that up, you'll see that we have this very large and square storage bin. You could probably easily put gallons of milk right in there if you were so inclined. And on the inside there, we find a 12-volt power outlet and a USB charge-only port. The LCD gives us a digital speed readout, digital tachometer at the top, the gear that we're in, so park, drive, etc. And then the section down below is configurable. So we have the access to our torque distribution for the all-wheel drive system, our trip computer information, phone, navigation, now playing that pulls information even from Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, vehicle maintenance, and of course settings for the system, or you can actually blank it out if you don't want to see anything down there. The steering wheel is the same basic design that we see in the Pilot. It's a 4-spoke model with paddle shifters on the back. We have down on the left and up over there on the right. You'll find the controls for the infotainment system over here on the left, track forward, backward, volume up, down. The home button, back button, and enter button relate to that multifunction LCD instrument cluster right there. We then have some dedicated buttons for the phone and voice command. And then on the right side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the standard radar adaptive cruise control system. Even though the Passport is notably shorter than the Honda Pilot, a little over 6 inches, it doesn't end up being that much lighter than the Honda Pilot. That's something that we've seen with other vehicles out there when they're lengthened and shortened. That's because the bulk of the crash structures and all the other things going on in the interior, that's where a lot of the weight is, and those things simply don't change from Pilot to Passport. That means that when it comes to overall performance numbers, you should expect the two vehicles to be relatively similar because we have the same engine, basically the same transmission under the hood. In our last test, the Honda Pilot ran from 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, so I expect that this Passport is going to be doing 0 to 60 in basically the same time, although there's a possibility it could be maybe 1/10 of a second faster. Now, when it comes to the braking distance, this is actually likely going to brake shorter than the Honda Pilot because the top-end trims actually get wider tires. We have those 265 width tires all the way around, and that's likely going to have a positive impact not just on the braking scores, but also on the handling ability of the Passport. That kind of plays into Honda's mission when developing this vehicle versus the Pilot. This is supposed to be the sportier model, the more off-road model, the model that's really oriented to someone that doesn't necessarily have 3 rows worth of passengers inside. Now again, we haven't had the opportunity to test this on our own home turf, so be sure and stay tuned for our complete review when we can get you our official 0 to 60 times, 60 to 0 times, etc. But I'm going to go ahead and guess that this model is probably going to stop somewhere around 118, perhaps 120 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's probably going to be a fairly good time in this category. If you want to stop shorter, something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT or the Ford Edge ST are of course going to stop shorter than this, but they're not really in the same category. Honda is not trying to make a high-performance 2-row crossover like those upper-end models, but this is going to compare very well to the mainline or upper-level trims of the Ford Edge, the Hyundai Santa Fe, and of course the Nissan Murano. It's obvious that the overall suspension tune in this vehicle was trying to straddle the fence between those on-road focused options and the off-road focused options as well. This suspension is definitely firmer than something like the Nissan Murano or Jeep Grand Cherokee, but it's not quite as firm as those sporty trims of the Ford Edge. That's because Honda is really trying to give the Passport sort of a split personality here. They want this to be more capable on-road and more capable off-road than their other crossovers in their lineup. So when it comes to absolute handling grip, this is likely going to handle better than the Honda CR-V, definitely better than the Honda Pilot, but it's also designed to be more off-road capable than either of those other Honda crossovers out there. So when it comes to overall handling in this segment, I'm probably going to give this somewhere around the A to A- category, but again, we won't know for sure until we can get this home and of course compare it to its direct competitors. Cabin quietness is pretty good in this model. It maintains all of the same upper level features that we find in the Pilot as far as active noise cancellation, the strong dedication to a lot of foam being injected all around the vehicle in order to help improve overall cabin quietness. That is something that we see in basically every other entry in this mid-size 2-row crossover segment. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more civilized than the average RAV4 or CR-V out there, that's why you would want to step up to this particular category. When it comes to overall fuel economy, you should expect this to get around the EPA numbers, because in our recent testing of the 2019 Honda Pilot, it basically hit the EPA numbers right on the head. However, this vehicle does have those 2 different tire options, as I said earlier, and you should expect the base models with the narrower tires to likely get slightly better fuel economy than the upper level trims. Now, the way that the EPA works with fuel economy numbers, Honda does not have to necessarily split those numbers out as long as they're close enough, but in real world driving, you may notice a slight difference. Before we move on, we should definitely talk a little bit about this all-wheel drive system, because the Honda iVTM system is one of the most capable front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive systems available on the market. The way this system operates is that there's actually an overdrive unit between the transmission up front and the rear axle in the back, and that overdrive unit actually makes the rear axle spin ever so slightly faster than the front axle. That's how we get that effective 70% engine power to the rear axle under certain circumstances. Now, that's not at full throttle, and it's not all the time. It's depending on the throttle, depending on exactly what the car wants to do, the corner that you're in, etc. But that is still more than you'll find in a Hyundai Santa Fe, the Ford Edge, even the ST trim, Nissan Murano, etc. And that's part of why the Passport and the Pilot feel a little bit lighter than they actually are, because if you are going into a corner and you floor this vehicle and you really start pushing a little bit harder in the corners, it feels a little bit lighter because it actually has the ability to help steer the rear end with that extra power on the rear wheels. Now, the obvious benefit to this system off-road is that it can send more power to that rear axle more frequently than the competitive systems. And again, we have that torque vectoring axle in the rear. So as you're going off-road, it can automatically overdrive that outside rear wheel to help keep you in a straight line. It's really noticeable if you're driving this vehicle fast out on a dirt or gravel road that it really has more bite and more turn-in than you'd think this vehicle should. Obviously, with the Passport, Honda has not taken us out to the most rigorous off-road course that's suitable only for lifted Wranglers or certain models of Land Rover or that sort of thing, because that's not necessarily the mission of the Passport. But they have taken us out to a more difficult section of the trail where lesser crossovers might have problems. With an extra inch of ground clearance versus the Honda Pilot, this is going to be a little bit more capable off-road. So you're going to get a little bit of extra approach angle, a little bit better departure angle, a little bit better breakover angle as well. Now, the departure angle is the best in this versus the Pilot because, of course, we have a shorter rear end than the Pilot, although the limiting factor with this is still going to be the front overhang and that approach angle up front. If, of course, you want to take things to the next level and you really want to go rock crawling, then you are going to have to step up into something like a 4Runner TRD Pro or a Jeep Grand Cherokee Trailhawk. But it's pretty easy to tell that this is going to be much more off-road capable than some of the crossovers in this segment that are closer to the ground, something like a Nissan Murano, and also definitely something that doesn't have the torque vectoring and limited slip functionality of this rear axle that we find in the Pilot and, of course, in this Passport. Now, the one thing you will definitely notice when you take the Passport off the beaten path is that this suspension is still fairly firm for an off-road vehicle. So if you are planning on taking your Passport on the rocks that we're driving on here, it will definitely do it, but you are going to get a lot more motion in the cabin, a lot more of a kidney punch than in some of those softer entries. Now, obviously that's because Honda was still focusing on-road driving performance, and if they were to make this vehicle a little bit firmer in terms of the overall suspension tune, then it wouldn't have the same on-road capabilities that we have in this vehicle. So they're really trying to straddle the fence between these two categories. So how much will it cost and when can you get your hands on one? Well, Honda tells us that this will be available in dealers starting right around February 4th. They've actually been in production since December of 2018. Honda decided to make the Passport a little bit more premium than some of the other entries in their lineup as far as base trims go. So they're not starting this with LX like some of their other models. Instead, this is starting in the Sport trim for about $32,000. Now, all-wheel drive is still optional, just like you find in actually the 4Runner and the Jeep Grand Cherokee as well. It's a $1,900 option on all of the trims except for the top-end Elite trim, which is again the one that we have been driving today. That puts the base model of the Passport right around where the bulk of the competition is in this particular segment, but notably more than the Hyundai Santa Fe. Now, the Santa Fe is kind of an unusual option in this larger two-row crossover segment because it does start with a 4-cylinder engine and a lot less power under the hood than basically every other entry, because Hyundai is trying to span kind of a greater distance with their vehicle than Honda is with the Passport for 2019. If you want the EXL trim, which gives you the leather interior primarily, you'll step up to $36,410. The Touring trim is the first vehicle that would give you factory navigation. Of course, we also get upgraded audio in that model, $39,280. I think that's actually a pretty good spot to stop with this particular lineup, although remember that you do have to add $1,900 for all-wheel drive, and if you do that, then you might as well get the Elite trim right here for $43,680 because this does have all-wheel drive standard, and this is the only one that's going to give you the ventilated seats and the heated steering wheel. As I usually say, you will have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparisons and, of course, our instrumented tests. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about how it compares right now. The Hyundai Santa Fe, as I said, is significantly less expensive, but it also marches to a slightly different drummer. We have less standard feature content in that Santa Fe, and we have that 4-cylinder engine under the hood. If you work your way on up the ladder, we get more powerful engines and more feature content, but by the time you've done that, it could actually be a little bit more expensive than a comparably equipped Passport. Now, personally, I like the interior a little bit more in the Santa Fe than the Passport. The Passport has basically lifted the interior out of the Honda Pilot, installed it inside this two-row crossover vehicle. And because of its overall age, it doesn't feel quite as fresh as what we see in the brand new Hyundai Santa Fe. But I have to say that this interior feels a little bit more elegant than what we see in the Ford Edge, because the Ford Edge has actually been around for quite some time as well. They've recently facelifted it. They've done some interior, some exterior tweaks. We have a video on that new tweaked model on our channel already, but I think that the Passport feels a little bit better put together than that Edge, and it's more off-road capable for sure. That is one of the big differentiating features between this and the Santa Fe and the Edge and the Murano in that particular little category there. This has that torque vectoring rear axle, which has that limited slip functionality right there. We have slightly better ground clearance than the average entry in this particular segment, and definitely more of an off-road focus thanks to the standard feature content and some of the options that are available. Versus the Honda CR-V, we have a slightly more premium feel on the inside. The interior, again, lifted out of the Pilot, feels a little bit bigger, a little bit more roomy and spacious than what we find in the CR-V. And you'll notice a big difference in the third row. It's much wider, and the seats are generally more comfortable than what we find in the smaller Honda. And of course, if you're looking for a naturally aspirated V6 and a traditional automatic transmission, you'll find those in this vehicle. You won't find them in the CR-V. Now, versus something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee or the Toyota 4Runner, obviously this is less off-road capable. There are just no two ways about that. But this is going to be less expensive and a little bit better on-road. Even though the Grand Cherokee itself is also trying to sit on the fence between on-road and off-road capability, it's definitely more focused towards off-road ability, and that does hurt its on-road performance. Now, you can get things like a V8 engine insanely powerful V8 engines, a diesel engine, etc. in that Grand Cherokee, air suspensions, locking differentials, etc. None of those you will find on this Honda, but it's going to be significantly more expensive. Basically the same sort of thing goes for the 4Runner, except that the 4Runner feels particularly old in this segment, and it is also notably more expensive than this Honda right here. For the average person that's going out on country trails in the snow, even some of the rockier courses that we were driving on today, the Passport is going to be just fine. You really don't need to step up to that next level in order to actually accomplish those tasks. And it's important to remember that we were driving around on these trails and in the snow with regular all-season tires. Now, I never recommend that you drive in the snow on all-season tires. I always say get winter tires, and if you're going off-road, get all-terrain tires. But Honda did this just to prove exactly what you could do with standard everyday tires on their particular vehicles. So with all that out of the way, let me know what you think about the Passport down there in the comment section below, and let me know what you would like us to cover when we actually do our full review on the new 2019 Passport. I'll see you next week.